Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're just getting our mics turned up here. Welcome to our discussion on continuous evaluation. It's titled Balancing Privacy and Security. And for those of you who know me, I don't think there's any such thing as a balance between privacy and security. The government is always going to rely on and lean on securing its, at least its crown jewels, its capabilities. And that's why we have to consent to get our clearances. We consent to a broad range of access by the government to what most Americans would consider to be their private information. So that's the conversation for this afternoon, is where are we at with continuous evaluation today? We've, as most of the people in the room, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because that would be sort of crazy. I presume most of you have got security clearances, have had security clearances sometime in your career. And so you know that in the old ways, and I'm old so I can talk about old, we've filled out a Form 86, disclosed a bunch of information, private information, under oath to the government that was true and complete, answered the questions, submitted to an investigator asking us probably the same questions, reading back the form to us, making sure that we understood that what we provided was under oath and was true and correct. And then the government went out and gathered a bunch of information, usually using a lot of shoe leather, knocking on doors, going to police departments, going to the doctor's office, collecting information and pulling it back. And then adjudicators make an adjudicated decision. What's the level of clearance that we're going to adjudicate this person to? And in the old days, it was confidential, but now it's just secret, top secret, and of course, programs beyond that, SCI or special access programs. The government has changed the paradigm, and we are really lucky today to have both representatives from the policy side of the fence and the practical implementation side of the fence, moving from a routine, aperiodic reinvestigation to maintain that trust determination to what's called continuous evaluation. And at the same time the government is moving in that direction, we're also seeing a lot of movement in a creation of a new security paradigm called trusted workforce. And what is the difference between what we did in the past and what are we talking about going to the future in this new environment of trusted workforce? So we're hoping to explore that over the next hour, the change or shift into a new model, how much difference will there be, but we're going to really focus most of our time on this whole continuous evaluation question. What's the government asking? How is it going about asking it? Who's it asking it from? To what extent is that information automated, or at least being tried to capture in an automated data environment, pull it back? How is the government assessing that information, recording that information, maintaining that information, how often, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're going to move into today and talk about. I encourage your questions. There should be some 3x5 or 4x6 cards on the chairs. If you would be so kind as to legibly write down a question. It doesn't have to be a full sentence. As long as I can get the gist of what you're talking about, that'll be fine. I don't intend to read them verbatim. We'll be happy to enjoy the audience questions as we move through the panel. I hope you bothered getting scanned in when you came in the door if you're going to be getting credit or applying for credit for the continuing education credits that are offered in this breakout session. If you didn't, please run back and do that. Even though the form says they do that at the end, I noticed they're doing it at the beginning. So I think that's it. Oh, one other caveat. Please know that this is a quote-unquote on-the-record conversation, panelists and audience members. There is media present. The event is being recorded, so if you're undercover, please put a bag over your head now and change your voice up if you happen to ask a question out loud. Okay, so joining me today, I'm really pleased with this panel, and thanks to INSA for reaching out and getting these great members to join us up here. Sharon Claridge is sitting right down here. She is a representative, works on internal security at Booz Allen Hamilton. The reason it's important, Sharon has a background in government, in the security practice. The reason it's important to have somebody from the private sector besides myself sitting up here is because, particularly from Booz Allen, I'm hoping that Sharon will share with us the extent to which in the private sector, and maybe even Booz in particular, what they are doing to secure their workforce in this new data-rich environment we find ourselves in. So Sharon, welcome. We're really happy that you could join us. Brian Dunbar, all the way down the end, is from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center of the Office of Director of National Intelligence. The entire enterprise of continuous evaluation is under Brian's purview. He works for Bill Evanina, and I'm sure most of you either know him or know of him. Ben Huebner is from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. For those of you who have been around the space for a while, you remember Alex Joel. Alex has got a great gig teaching and still getting a government salary someplace. But Ben came over from the CIA, where he is the new director of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy and Transparency. So we're really happy that Odie and I let Ben out of his cage and let him come over and sort of help talk to us in from the privacy and civil liberties standpoint. And last but certainly not least, is one of the main drivers of continuous evaluation in government. Trish Stokes is currently the Director of Defense Vetting at the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, having moved over to its predecessor organization, Defense Security Service, DSS. Has it been a full year yet, or just, no. So left the Army, came over to DSS, they whipsawed, changed the name, and still Trish is really, I would say, a driving force on the whole continuous evaluation and changing the paradigm on how we gather and assess information and make those risk determinations, those trust determinations in people. So that's our panel. I hope you will, now knowing who's sitting up here with me, I guess I should tell you who I am. I'm Dave Buckley, I'm a managing director at KPMG. I spent 35 years in government. Started a long time ago with OSI and ended at the CIA as the Inspector General, and now working at KPMG with federal and commercial clients, but mostly federal clients, and a lot of the space with INSA and the Security Policy Reform Committee, or Council. So that's us. So let's get started. Trish, I'm going to start with you, and we're just going to do a sort of an interview method of our conversation up here. Why don't you describe for the audience where we are today and where we're going? We've got 1.4 million people, principally in the Department of Defense, enrolled in the DoD Continuous Evaluation Program. There's another program that Brian can talk about over at the ODNI for continuous evaluation. And we'll get to eventually what the differences are, similarities, but let's just talk about the DoD program, if you would, and just give the audience a flavor of where we find ourselves today and where we're going. I think everybody understands why, but I think they're all live.
Are they on? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. So Dave, to your question, so we have, again, 1.4 million in the Department of Defense Continuous Evaluation Program. This program came over to the Defense Security Service probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, under something we called the Vetting Risk Operations Center. So it is the hub of the Department of Defense Continuous Evaluation Program. However, we are very much engaged in partnership, and I'm looking at Anita in the front row here, with our DNI brethren in their program. And that's really important because our program was founded on a set of automated records checks, mainly on the low side, so unclassified records checks. And as policy dictates certain criteria to meet continuous evaluation requirements, and certainly where we're going, which we'll talk about, continuous vetting, it requires, I'll just call it a hybrid of low side and high side checks. And so the Department of Defense made a very deliberate decision a few years back when they actually started piloting the continuous evaluation program, and I was around back then as the Director of Security for the United States Army, and we brought together a consensus of the willing, literally, in all of the military departments and the Fourth of State, and brought together something we called the Continuous Evaluation Program Management Office. And we started with a group of automated records checks and primarily focused on again, low side checks. And the reason for the continuous a continuous evaluation program at the time, and still in policy today, was to really supplement between periodic reinvestigations, eligibility for continued access to classified information. I think everybody realized, which is why we all moved to a continuous evaluation model, and now we're moving to a continuous vetting model, that, you know, a lot happens in a person's life in 5 years or 10 years, whatever the policy dictates, depending on the level of access that you have. And self-reporting just really wasn't getting it. It wasn't working. And so we started with the low side checks, very robust set of checks that literally meet just about all the criteria in the policy, to really kind of start getting lessons and learn and see how we were gleaning information before our regular scheduled periodic reinvestigations, and it was quite significant. In secret level clearances, we were gleaning information about 7 years in advance of ever getting that information, had we waited for a regular reinvestigation. And in the top secret world, probably more like 2 years in advance before we would have ever seen that information. But back to Ms. Hawkins and the DNI CE program, what that's going to do, it's going to get us it's going to round out our checks to get to a continuous vetting compliance perspective and get us those high side checks too. Again, deliberate decision on the government's part, DOD at that time, to not duplicate what DNI was putting in place, because that's good government. Why would we do that? And so Anita's got the program up and running now. It's very robust. Ours is as well. So we are joining together and filling any gaps that we have in data, so that, and it's very important now as we have become the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, because we will be the investigative service provider, providing continuous vetting as a shared service for the federal government and industry in the future. So that's a little teaser.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah, thank
Dave?
you very much. Brian, over to you. From a policy perspective, we've got this capability, obviously, where we can pulse data sets and learn more faster, hopefully better, about the cleared population, making that trust determination. But from a policy standpoint, what needs to change, or what has changed in this environment, if you will? And where are we going with Trusted Workforce 2.0?
Okay, thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here with you all. So, a couple of questions there, Dave. The first one, policy. So, there are two overarching policy issuances regarding continuous evaluation, which have been issued by OD&I. The first one is Security Executive Agent Directive number 6, which was issued in January of 2018. And then following that, in April of 2018, we issued Continuous Evaluation Implementation Guidelines for all departments and agencies at the practitioner level to use. CE, as you've already alluded to, is the use of a set of automated records checks. We're collecting information that we had traditionally collected by other means, as you said, and that was typically shoe leather investigative work, going out to places, asking questions, that kind of thing. There are 7 required data categories within CE as defined in our SEED. The first one is eligibility, which is simply a check of the clearance repositories to determine whether someone actually has a clearance and an existing record in there. We have a terrorism check, which is required. We have a public records check, which occurs, commercial data. Those are things like, bankruptcies, civil judgments, that kind of thing. We have foreign travel, see where people are going and coming from. We have credit checks, and we have suspicious financial transactions. And I think I hit all 7 there of the required CE data categories. So the OD&I CE system, we were responsible at the place where I am, and I want to give a shout out to Anita Hawkins, who is here today in the audience. She actually does all the work regarding our CE program. She is the program manager for that. But we have two charges in regard to CE. As Dave mentioned earlier, we're responsible, the DNI is actually responsible as the security executive agent for overarching policy, guidance, and oversight across the executive branch regarding things like clearances, investigations, adjudications, polygraph, all those kind of usual suspects, if you will. So that's one charge that we have. The other charge that we have was to build a CE IT system that would be capable of delivering flags and alerts across these 7 required data categories that I mentioned to departments and agencies that have cleared populations. That's a daunting task, as you might imagine, when you consider there are upwards and above 150 different departments and agencies out there who have cleared populations, and they vary in capabilities and resources from very fulsome along those lines. You know, that would be departments, agencies like the big 6 within the IC, down to organizations that are not resourced to that level from a security standpoint. So building this system was a heavy lift indeed. I'm happy to say that last year we became operational across all 7 of those required data categories. The system is bidirectional, which means we have high and low side capability. Trish alluded to that earlier. And we are delivering checks, flags, and alerts to a multitude of subscribing departments and agencies across the federal space. Departments and agencies can come into us and elect to have the ODNI CE system provide them all of the required checks across those 7 data categories I mentioned. They can elect to utilize the ODNI system for some, which is what Trish mentioned a minute ago in regard to the Department of Defense, or if they have a way to obtain these, they have their own unique capability to do this, they can do them on their own. Not seeing a lot of people doing these on their own out there because, again, as I mentioned, very heavy lift. Part of the heavy lift entailed interagency agreements with data providers. That's really hard within the federal space because, of course, this is PII data. It needs to be very heavily protected for very good reason. So to your question, Dave, that's in a nutshell what the ODNI CE system is and the policy around it. The second part of your question had to do with Trusted Workforce 2.0. And so that I don't monopolize all of the time here today on the panel, because I could literally talk for days.
Don't do that.
As we have talked for days within the interagency, months, in fact, about this initiative. But Trusted Workforce 2.0 is the major interagency initiative going on across the federal space to modernize, reform, transform, whatever particular adjective along those lines you'd like to use, the vetting enterprise across the security, suitability, and credentialing domains. So the 2 executive agents for the federal government, which is ODNI, as I mentioned, and OPM, because the director of OPM acts and serves as the executive agent for the suitability and credentialing domain, partnered on this along with a lot of key other interagency partners. One of the major ones is the Department of Defense, obviously, given the fact that they have the great majority of the cleared individuals within the federal space. So we started out this effort 2.0 last year. We've initially very quickly determined that we wanted to break the effort into 2 distinct phases, because I should also mention that in addition to this being a really good idea to modernize this system, we had kind of a predicator event driving us at the time as well, which was the backlog, AKA Charlie Phelan always wants me to use the term inventory. The inventory, or AKA backlog, of background investigations at the National Background Investigations Bureau. That was a huge driver at the very senior executive branch level, and also on the Hill, huge demand signal, do something about this, fix this issue regarding the backlog. So the Trusted Workforce 2.0 gives us the opportunity to both address that as well as transform, modernize, reform the enterprise. So we broke it into two distinct phases. Phase one was that look at how do we reduce and eventually eliminate this backlog, aka inventory, of background investigations at NBIB. So that's what we started out doing first thing out of the box. Within the interagency, we developed about 15 discrete specific mitigation measures that Charlie, Phelan, and NBIB could utilize in order to reduce with alacrity the background investigations backlog over at NBIB. We codified that and issued it in June of 2018 in executive correspondence from the DNI and director of OPM. So at that point, Charlie, and I should also mention NBIB had also done great things under Charlie's leadership already internally to take steps to begin reducing the backlog and eventually eliminate it. But with the combination of the EC and things Charlie had already put into place, I'm happy to say that phase one of the Trusted Workforce 2.0 has gone very well. We started out with a backlog of, again, this was last year in June. The backlog was about 725,000 background investigations at NBIB as of this week. I believe we were at 333, and that is fantastic progress, and especially when you consider the fact that NBIB needs, and soon to be DOD needs, a steady state of about 225,000 background investigations in churn at any one time. So you can see how close we are in terms of actually eliminating that backlog. So that was phase one of Trusted Workforce 2.0. Phase two, equally as important, if not more, is the transformation, reformation, modernization of the system. So we started that effort out. Once we got the EC out in June of last year, we started phase two. Phase two, we promised, and I'm just nutshelling here for you all again, because there's a ton of nuance and detail that I don't, again, want to monopolize the time, but we started out in July. We have an executive steering group of very senior executive level leaders from across the enterprise. We have industry represented as well in the executive steering group, and we had the charge by December of 2018 to have developed new approach framework, if you will, the studying for what the new enterprise is going to look like. So we did that, and I'll just give you real quickly here brief highlights of what it looks like. So it's a 1-3-5 model. That's the easiest way to think about it, and that's the most basic way I can explain it to you. One aligned vetting system that crosses the security, suitability, and credentialing domains, because we've been very stovepiped in the past. The security domain has been its own stovepipe, while the suitability and credentialing domain exists over here in another stovepipe. So 1-3-5, one single aligned enterprise for security, suitability, and credentialing. As you know, there are currently 5 investigative tiers that exist right now. Under this model, this approach, we're collapsing those 5 tiers down to 3. The best way for you to think of those 3 tiers is low, which would be things like public trust, medium, which would be high-risk public trust or secret level clearance, high, top secret clearance, top secret SCI, I should mention there. So that's the 3 part of this. The 5 part of it is 5 vetting scenarios underneath those 3 tiers, if you will. 5 vetting scenarios: initial vetting, which is self-explanatory. It's people coming from the outside into the trusted domain. The second vetting scenario is the most important one in my mind. That's the really, really, truly transformative aspect of this. The second vetting scenario is continuous vetting. And that's where we throw in things like CE and move away from the traditional periodic reinvestigation model we've operated under for as long as I can remember, to this concept of continuous vetting, of which CE is a very big part. Then we have transfer of trust scenario. Transfer of trust, what you know today, is reciprocity. Then the next vetting scenario is upgrade, self-explanatory. And then the last one is reestablishment of trust, and that is mobility. How does someone move in and out of the trusted domains in an efficient and quick manner? Because right now, if you go out of that domain for over 24 months, kind of start over again in terms of vetting you, we don't believe that's the right way to do things in the future. So again, there's a whole lot of level underlying detail on this, but I'm not going to belabor it anymore. But that's kind of Trusted Workforce 2.0 in a nutshell. And as we go along here today, if we have time, I can tell you about next steps, but I think I'll stop.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that, the groundwork here. There's a tremendous amount, obviously, for the audience, a tremendous amount of work that's being done in the back. It's not necessarily behind closed doors, but the government is really engaged in trying to figure out this next phase, and so that all the departments and agencies, not just because they're told to, will buy into the next generation solutioning. Ben, although we didn't touch on any major differences, I know in your role is to make sure that, well, I'm going to presume I know what your role is. I'll tell you what I think your role is, at least your office, is to oversee and understand and sort of vet where the government's going, not just in this world, but across the intelligence enterprise, to protect, as they're hell-bent on protecting national security, you've got the other side of the blade in protecting personal privacy, civil liberties, to make sure that these programs, and all the programs, don't overstep the bounds of, we'll just say, law. How are we doing here, and what are some of the things that you all have reviewed, maybe pushed back on, or controlling?
So I think, thank you all for having me. Sure. So I think a couple things. So I'm going to push back on the moderator, which is always dangerous.
Go ahead.
It is not so much a balance. It is not generally so much two sides of the blade. For a lot of these security and privacy and civil liberties issues, we are actually going to the same place, although coming at it sometimes from a different starting point, right? Brian's folks, all the folks up here, care desperately about getting it right, getting the accuracy. I also care about that from a privacy and civil liberties perspective, right? All of these folks are trying to increase the signal-to-noise ratio, right? There's a lot of data out there, but ultimately what we are doing is not trying to collect the most amount of data. What we are trying to do is identify threats, right? And reducing that signal-to-noise ratio. Again, I care about from a privacy and civil liberties perspective, but we all care about that. And the methods that we use to do that, I think, actually often are comparable as well. I think in terms of how we're doing, I think we're actually doing quite well on this. We are in part doing quite well because we are thinking about these things on the front end, right? So this is not after the fact oversight, although there is an oversight component to it. Our folks were lined up with Brian's folks from really day one in terms of scoping these issues out. And I think that is a really critical component. And when I'm talking about scoping these issues out, I think it's also really critical to think about A, why, and B, what. So why? Look, we ask a lot from our clearance holders. We ask them to give consent to an enormous amount of collection, and we do so appropriately given the information that they gain access to. Because we ask so much of them, we have a huge responsibility to appropriately handle that information. And that starts at the collection standpoint in terms of figuring out what are we going to collect and how is that going to be used to achieve that mission that we all share. So that is definitely a starting point. For privacy, that is the starting point. It is not the ending point, right? We do have to think about collection, but we are also thinking about our retention of that information. How long are we keeping it? What systems are we keeping it? As we build out that IT enterprise, how are we protecting the information? Who has access to it? I care about all those things for privacy and civil liberties, but we also care about those things, right? For a lot of reasons. You know, the intelligence community, kind of known for access controls for a lot of different reasons. But that's among the other things that protects. Privacy is one of those things. We have to think about it in terms of how we use it. You know, if we are going to, let's take something, I'm going to step a little bit away from continuous evaluation. If we talk about user activity monitoring, what are going to be our triggers to ensure that the information that is provided back is more likely to be security relevant? Again, goes to efficiency, goes to making sure that continuous evaluation, those continuous vetting works well. Also a privacy control in terms of not having irrelevant information be used as much as possible. We're looking at accountability, we're looking at leadership throughout these programs to figure out who is responsible for each of these things. We're looking at the internal and external oversight. We're looking at training, and that really gets back to that responsibility, right? If we are going to give those who are charged with this important mission the responsibility for handling some incredibly sensitive information at times, we then in turn also have the responsibility to train those folks, sometimes within an inch of their lives, on what those privacy and civil liberties controls are, so that they can act as they need to act, so that they know those rules backwards and forwards. And that's something that my office has been, with our Office of General Counsel, very much involved in doing that. And I think sort of lastly, something that I think about a lot is transparency, which is a tough one in general for the intelligence community, particularly in this space. But the reason that I think a lot about transparency is when I look back at some of our largest, some of our most impactful insider threat issues over the last few years. From my knowledge of those incidents, it has generally not been the case that there has been a lack of flags, right? There's often been a lot of flags. Sometimes half of those flags have been on fire. And yet people did not, within the workforce, within the other clearance holders, trust their own internal security program to come forward and say, you know, you might need to look at Ben. There's something there. And so what we need to do is protect those sources and methods for how we're doing some of this continuous evaluation, but at the same time provide enough information so that our clearance holders, our workforce, has trust in the system, enough trust in the system so on that day they can say, gosh, I have a concern about Ben. I'm going to bring it to the appropriate folks. And I know that that concern, that information is going to be appropriately handled. If there's nothing there, it's going to be evaluated, it's going to be closed, only the right people will have access to it, and nothing will come of it. And if there is something there and there is a problem, that's going to be appropriately handled as well.
Yeah, great. We'll come back to that. Sharon, let's talk a little bit about the private sector. And you can start where Ben left off. How do you get a workforce to trust a system, series of policies, procedures, et cetera, but more importantly, the people that are implementing those things? In your situation, the private sector, where you're looking at a fairly large organization, monitoring the behavior in that organization, what are some things that you've seen, some best practices in getting the workforce to trust this trust-determining system?
That's a good question, Dave. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And you made some excellent points, because we have faced these same challenges in terms of we wanted to be really, really transparent. So I will say, first, we at Booz Allen, we have a population of about 27,000 people. About 70% of our folks have security clearances. We implemented our own continuous evaluation program last year, so it's been operational for over a year, and we applied it to our entire workforce, even those who did not have clearances. So you can imagine, it was a heavy lift in terms of communication, transparency, change management, to educate the workforce on what this was going to be for Booz Allen, what it meant, how it worked, We took several months to do that. In fact, we held all kinds of office hours, briefings, at the end, one-on-one sessions, because participation in this program was made as a condition of continuing employment at the firm. So I will say we have a lesson learned from that is because the consequences were serious, we were so transparent, and we told them exactly how it worked. And I think it was quite alarming to most of our folks because they're not used to that much transparency, right? But we felt that was the right thing to do. And then they had to sign consent, right? So I think it was worth the process, definitely, in the end. I mean, I was sweating bullets in my team because we had a deadline. We had a consent window. We set that to be a month long, and at the end of that window, if people declined to participate, we began the exit process. I didn't know how many people that was going to be. Neither did our CEO, and so that was scary for everybody on my team and me, but in the end, less than 5 people opted out.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. So what I really want to share with it is this is just one piece. We have a very holistic approach. And we call it trusted workforce. So I'm sorry not to be confused at all with trusted workforce 2.0. But it started about 5 years ago. You might imagine our firm was keen to build a effective and robust insider threat detection program, right? And it started and it matured, but very quickly we realized we're a people business. We bring talent to the government's toughest problems, right? And we needed a system that was very employee-centric, and it wasn't just a security or a CI system. It was a people system. And so really when we look at it as a wellness, resilience, and security approach. So we've put a lot of resources and supports in place. One of the things that we've seen out of our continuous evaluation program in the last year that was actually shocking was how many people were really in financial distress. So we use the automated records checks. TransUnion is our financial vendor, and we get real-time reporting, right? And we realized that there were a lot of people really struggling, and particularly newer employees with a lot of student debt. And so that has shaped our people programs. Like now we have a lot of financial wellness planning, webinars, resources, counselors, in addition to just a standard EAP program. And in fact, if we receive an alert like that, then we provide tailored supports and assistance to that person, sometimes including HR support, because we'll get sometimes different responses. Somebody says, oh, yeah, I forgot that. I'm going to pay this bill now. But sometimes we get a response back, and this is part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So for private sector, we have to give them a period of time to respond. We review it. It's very stringently controlled, the privacy of the controls under that act. And sometimes what we see is really a cry for help, where it's a 2-page response where somebody is like, I got behind on my bills because I went through this and there was a fire and I have a special needs kid and my spouse isn't working and I don't know what to do. And that's where we can really route real support. We're having in-person HR, working with the person's supervisor, working with the person themselves if they need accommodations and that kind of thing. And I think that's what I'm most proud of, right? Because we want, our interest is a little bit different from the government's. It's not about continuing eligibility for a clearance, although it is to some good degree. It's about making sure we're delivering a trusted workforce to our clients and that we're taking care of our people because they are our most critical asset, right?
Fantastic. As we go through the rest of the hour, I would encourage you just to give other vignettes, because obviously I hate to name the company, the company was in trouble, and actually hired Bob Mueller to come in and review the programs.
It was his gig before this big gig.
Before his last gig, yeah. And with a series of recommendations that the firm then implemented. And so let's just peel this back a little bit. Ben, authorized use for just a minute. When we're talking about data, the purpose for which you're gathering information, and then once you see the information, and Tricia, maybe you want to play with this one too, once you see it, the reason I asked the question was for a security determination. Now I've got the information, I realize there's another use. And it'd be a great use. Are we building our programs well enough and acquiring, retaining, and evaluating the information so that it can be used for other purposes, not necessarily just a security or trust determination? Do we need to play with that policy?
It's a tough question, because I think that, so it's a partial yes and a partial no. And I think it's a partial no in terms of this is a little bit of a difference between government and the private sector.
Right.
Government has less flexibility in that space. And what we do need to do is, as we, I'm going to geek out on privacy here, as we build out our Privacy Act system of records notices, SORNs, we need to have a relatively expansive definition on what those uses are, as long as they relate back to that original security purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So if we can build it into that process to include informing our workforce, hey, these are the scope that we're going to be using this, right? The authorized purpose here is security, but we are defining security to include these aspects of wellness. That is something that we have some ability to do. I think one of the difficult areas that come are ensuring that you have the right lines, so that, for example, if someone is going to EAP, right? So that being able to provide resources that people know and trust will help them, but also will not sort of automatically result in them losing their clearance. And yet, this is where it gets difficult. There are things that can come out of that process that are disqualifying.
Sure.
And so part of this, again, goes to that whole life cycle of ensuring that the information that we do collect, that we are upfront in terms of what our purposes are, but we get that right scope in terms of who has access to that information and for what purposes.
Thanks. Tricia, do you want to
Yeah, I can
talk
add a
for
little
a minute?
bit. Well, it's a really interesting question, but as we roll out the new National Background Investigative Service that Mr. Terry Carpenter from DISA is building for all of us, what we have found in deploying that capability, building, developing, and more importantly, us on the tip of the spear executing, implementing it, is those systems of record notices and that data, getting the data into the system, and those connection agreements they're critical, and the SORNs matter. And so I would say, there is nothing we do without our privacy lawyers and OGC not attached to our hip and looking at everything that we're doing to the point, even to the point where our data service providers, we may have, and we do, have a pretty robust continuous vetting, personnel vetting SORN for National Background Investigation Service. But we have the agencies that are providing that information make sure that their attorneys look at it on their end, and their Privacy Act attorneys make sure that their individual SORNs, not just our SORN, is covering them for the purpose of the use of this information. So we're like doubling down to make sure that we have the checks in the right block, because this is very serious. If you remember, there was a breach. We all were affected.
Yep.
And that was very serious. And I can tell you that cybersecurity in building and protecting the data that it will be running through this new National Background Investigation Service, there's nothing more important. We need the data, we want to do it right, we want to mitigate risk. I think the processes that Brian described to you and the way we're going to execute the new business model just makes so much sense. But that precious PII data has got to be first and foremost, protected. And so everything that we're doing is under the guise and under the lens of making sure we're meeting the Privacy Act and protecting PII and the laws and the regulations that go with that. So hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. But back at you with this question. So again, I'm an old guy, filled out that Form 86 with a pen or a manual typewriter at the beginning. I know what you're asking me about. I presume I'm the best source of information when you're making a trust determination. But today, I can't give you my credit report. I guess I could order it and send it to you, but you've got a better way of getting that information. So here's the question. Let's get down into the weeds a little bit from a CE standpoint, not insider threat program, but the CE standpoint. We heard the categories of information, so we really don't need to go way down, but what are you asking for today and looking at that you didn't have before in the every 5 to 7 year periodic reinvestigation, if there's any difference there? And what do you hope to gather in the future? What's the, not 10 years from now, but 4 or 5 years from now, what do you think is going to be online that you can get access to better illuminate me as you're making that continuous, not just aperiodic, but continuous trust determination? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So I would suggest to you that the general categories, the logical categories of information that we look at today in that tedious form that we all fill out, the same general categories of information make sense. We kind of want to know if you're going to be dealing with classified information that your criminal history is not is in check. You're not a terrorist. That you're maintaining your finances in a responsible manner, because if you can maintain your personal life, generally speaking, that can translate to protecting classified information. So those same categories of information are still pertinent and relevant. I think that we've all figured that out, even looking at the behavioral scientists and all the people that we've had looking at Trusted Workforce 2.0, Brian. But I think it's how we get that information, how often we get that information, that is the difference in this business model. I would also suggest to you this, that I've always said, are we looking at the right information? So making sure that we do routine assessments of the return on investment of the information that we are gleaning and asking for and assessing. Is it getting us to the trust decision and the criteria that we've established for the trust decision to be made in the first place? And that's where I think our community has not done a good job in the past in being, I'll just call it, in a more state-of-the-art current. And I think that's where we have found, and this is what we've committed, and I'd probably just ask Brian to weigh in here. We've committed to a new model of continuous improvement, continuous assessment, performance of ourselves, judging ourselves on how well we're doing, and always assessing the status quo and never letting a model linger for however many years it was, and there's folklore and then there's facts, but it was a lot of years before we've changed this business model, let's face it. So I think that's what's different today, but I think generally speaking, the logical same criteria applies, but how we do it, how often we do it, how we look at it, more transparency, more input from the subject, more input from the subject supervisor, things of that nature, that's what I see as different today.
Great. So Brian, thank you for that, Tricia. Brian, let's talk a little bit, I want to come back to Tricia too, but from a national perspective, from NCSC's standpoint and a policy standpoint, what's the impact of continuous evaluation on reciprocity? I'm going to come back to Tricia in a little bit on how we adjudicate today and how we probably will adjudicate tomorrow, but that's separate. What are we doing to guard to make sure that reciprocity, and that for the audience, that's one agency recognizing and trusting the trust determination in that adjudicative decision by that first agency, that without reinvestigating or re-adjudicating, they're going to accept that clearance transfer whether it's for a specific program, a tour of duty, or if you're a contractor, being able to go on to another contract simultaneously. What are we doing to protect that or strengthen reciprocity in this new environment?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I knew reciprocity would come up today somehow. So what you're going to have in the future, obviously, is right now reciprocity. You know, people are going into the systems of records, and you look in there, and you're looking for an in-scope, PR. And you're also looking if the gaining department or agency has an additional requirement, for example, polygraph, you're looking to see, whether there's an existing in-scope polygraph in there. Obviously, in the new world, if you will, you're not going to be able to look in there and see, oh yeah, there's that latest PR date. Instead, what you're going to see is an enrollment date in continuous evaluation, and you will also see whether, what kind of flags and alerts might have popped up, that kind of thing. But the key to ensuring that reciprocity occurs in this new world, if you will, is that all the departments, agencies across the space are confident and trusting of the CE systems, right? And I think we have that kind of consensus right now. I certainly know across the board that everyone not only has reached consensus that this is the way to go, as Trish mentioned, as a better way to do security, but I know that they've all bought in terms of what CE is and the kind of information that you're gathering there. So again, it really boils down to, again, that ensuring that there are not outlier departments or agencies there that have not bought in, if you will, to what CE is and what it's collecting. I don't know if that's responsive to your question.
Yeah, let's go to Tricia again just to talk about adjudication and the way we adjudicate today. Obviously, DOD's got a centralized adjudication function that's now inside DCSA. But, I picture hundreds of people in tennis shoes reading security files and making yes or no decisions. What's it going to look like, or maybe that's wrong, what's it going to look like in the future when you're pulsing, 1.4 million people's records and pulling data back and forth? How does the system, how does it operate today? How do you hope it to operate in the future? And Ben, I'm coming back to you after this question. If we're going to use machine learning and algorithms, Ben, what are your concerns about that or things that they should watch out for? Over to you, Tricia.
So I think just in general, adjudications as we've known them today, and rewriting the adjudicative guidelines is another aspect of my policy buddy down the row here. Another thing that is being done in Trusted Workforce 2.0 along with the federal investigative standards. Bringing them up to more currency, right? And I think the difference in the future adjudication is, if you look at the old model, you might say that there's 13 adjudicative criteria and of derogatory information that we're looking for. So it's kind of a checklist. Sound familiar? And then we mitigate, most of the mitigation in what is found as derogatory information is mitigated primarily with time. Did Danielle commit that crime 10 years ago, or, was it a misdemeanor 10 years ago, or was it yesterday? That's kind of a stark example. Today's adjudication is going to not just take, because if you think about it, we're in a continuous vetting model. I find something out on you tomorrow, right, that you did yesterday. So time's not going to be a mitigator. But what might be a mitigator and what will be, I think, in the new adjudicative model is what'd you do about it, okay? What outcome? What action did you take? Were you responsible or were you irresponsible? People have lives. People make mistakes. So I think it's kind of a different mindset. There's still time in there for initial investigations and things of that nature, but in a continuous vetting model, it's not it's not looking at these background investigations that I've collected 5 years of information or 10 years of information on you, and I'm getting in and I'm looking at it in the whole person concept. It's looking at microtransactions that are now happening much more rapidly and frequently. But the trend analysis, even in the microtransactions, makes a difference too. Did you take an action and then you made it all good, but then 6 months later it happened again? Okay, perhaps there's bad judgment there. So I think it's more abstract and more behavioral outcome driven than derogatory. No time mitigation, you're out. It's not that clear cut. And so this is going to be a training model that we are going to have to train our adjudicators. But if you think about it, it's the right model. These things are hard, but they're right. They're the right thing to do for our population and to protect our national security. And so nobody said this was easy. But that's probably the difference, I think, in the adjudication model of the future.
Perfect. Thank you for that great setup. Ben, you heard the word model. And I'm going to bring up the machine modeling and learning. What are some things we should be looking out for in that environment?
Bias.
You want to unpack that a little bit?
So I will unpack it. So without naming companies, so there are private sector companies, some very technically adept private sector companies who have used AI and in particular machine learning to screen some of the candidates that are applying, and have subsequently abandoned a lot of those efforts. And why was that? Well, why was it? It was they were using as their training data, because for any of these algorithms you have to start with a set of training data and a set of initial assumptions. And their training data was identifying who are our top performing candidates. And so they identified their top performing candidates, and they used that as effectively the model for screening applicants, and found that they were receiving effectively almost only white male engineers coming through. Why? Well, there was a history of discrimination within the underlying company, and they had identified those folks, the computer had identified those folks as the ones who went farthest along. And so if you were a member of the wrong sorority, the computer was screening your resume out. And that was the reason that the company had to abandon that effort. No one intended that. No one at all intended that. And when they found it, they ended up discontinuing the program. That's the big issue on the machine learning front that we need to think about. That is not to say that we are going to not use AI or not use machine learning. What we have to think very carefully about is what's the training data that we choose? And what's the underlying algorithm? What type of explainability, to use the machine learning term in here, do those results have? Do we know how we got to the result? And I think an absolute critical part of it is a lot of what Tricia just said. No one at all is talking about taking the human out of the loop in these processes. No one, right? We will be in the wrong place if we decide to go incredibly simplistic. Gosh, if your credit score goes below this number, your clearance is gone. Everyone understands that, everyone accepts that. I think as the models get more complicated, it's going to be a little bit tougher to evaluate that same sort of issue. But it's not difficult to determine whether we have a human in the loop. We got to figure out where to put that human in the loop, but we are always going to have a human in the loop.
Right. So Ben, thank you, Ben. So believe it or not, humans have bias too. Mm-hmm. And our adjudicators today, we've done studies. There was a good to great study. That's what it was called, and we did it in the PAC PMO, it showed bias. In adjudication. What I like about machine learning and AI is it just aids, for efficiency, and we all know we need efficiency. We do not need machines making decisions. That will never happen. You will never allow that. We don't want that. But what will happen, and what I've seen, and believe me, I'm getting a lot of technology demos these days, but there's a clear auditability to it that we don't have and we aren't getting from the human adjudicator. Because certainly they write up their decisions based on the criteria and the factors, but there's so much more information you can get from that model when you backtrack that what the model, what AI aided in making that human decision. So it's fascinating. And I think that we would be silly not to be leveraging the heck out of technology, not to replace humans, but to make our decisions better. And who doesn't want better decisions when we're talking about granting somebody access to classified information?
When we talk about this at ODNI, we talk about our AIM initiative, but AIM stands for Augmenting Intelligence Through Machines.
Right.
And that is exactly what we're doing in this area as well. We are augmenting the process, so we are making it better through the machines, but we are not replacing those folks.
Correct.
Thanks, Sharon. You told us a great story about getting buy-in, and you were actually surprised at the amount of buy-in. Maybe I can't imagine there were more people who thought for a second, I can find another job, but they decided to stay with the firm. They decided to stay with Booz Allen. Let's talk a little bit about the data that you're looking at. You may be looking at data that the government doesn't look at today. So I'd like you to talk about, and I'm going to be very specific. Do you look at social media of your employees? I don't know the answer to the question. If you do the employees know and understand that? And then I want to come back to the government, because there is a D&I policy that allows agencies to look at social media of cleared employees. Is anybody doing that in the government? And what are we learning? And I'll come back to that. We only have about 8 more minutes, so we're going to have to do some lightning questions here. Sharon.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So first I want to say,
Grab that microphone, please.
the company that Ben just referenced, it wasn't us.
No.
And we don't use that for pre-screening. So our CE program, and in fact, we call it enhanced evaluation within the firm, because I wanted to have a different name, because it's not exactly the same as the government program. The government has access to government-only sources like delinquent, tax records and things like that we're not going to have in private industry. So ours is comprised of commercially available electronic records checks, criminal, financial, civil matters. We also do an annual check of secondary competing employment. So if somebody else is working on the side, essentially doing the same type of thing, we look at that. But I also wanted to talk about the privacy aspect, because we were really conscious of that when we were designing this program. So we collect very, very little information, and that was something that we really, wanted to make sure our workforce understood. The way our program is set up is that if one of our employees, by identifying information that we've given to our vendors, and we have a suite of vendors for different things, a record pops up, it's an arrest record, then as soon as that's posted, the next day, usually, or within hours, we get a notice of it. But we don't get any information if there's no alert. So we don't even collect a credit report. Right? So for 99% of our population, we don't hold any of that privacy information, and I think that's really important. The other thing I was going to talk about, we're looking at, AI as well, and we use it as part of our insider threat, but not so much, it's an aggregation of some of the CE data, but it does get very complicated, because the data the risk indicators for different models of a risk. So some might be, CE might be a good indication of general trustworthiness and how people respond. One thing that we don't get electronically in records checks is foreign nexus, foreign contacts with a government or even an intelligence service. So so that has to be addressed a different way, right? But when we set up a different kind of models where we're looking at potentially at-risk populations, for example, our counterintelligence model, somebody who is a high performer, but then has unreported foreign travel and unreported, contacts that we've, now analyzed and realized are potential foreign intelligence. So, that's a very different model than we would run as a baseline model, right? So in the HR community, a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, high performer, they're probably fine, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they probably are, but in this specific, an insider CI nexus, maybe not, right? But it depends on, 15 different flags and some good solid analysis based on facts.
Yep. Okay, we've got 4 minutes left, and what I want to do is just run down. I'm going to ask my panelists, you got a minute. What's an issue that we haven't addressed or that you feel that needs to be talked about? And for the audience, just bear with us probably 5 minutes if you would. I'm going to start at the end.
I'll address an issue you just raised in a question before this.
Please.
But social media. So social media, in 2015, the DNI issued a directive that allowed departments and agencies to utilize social media and vetting personnel. There have been any number of research studies done, both, we've done a number of them, other people have done, DOD's done a lot of great work about this, that mixed results on the utility of social media and personnel vetting for the government. For example, some studies would suggest it a lot depends upon, I'm just going to say, the age of the individual who, like, DOD has gotten tremendous utility out of some of their social media pilots when you're running up against, a young enlisted person that's a prodigious user of social media. Other pilots have shown when you run up against somebody like Dunbar here, who has never had a social media account, probably never will, you get bupkis. So departments, agencies have not utilized social media to a great extent yet. It's also extremely costly because the data providers are industrial providers, and it just costs a lot, right? In Trusted Workforce 2.0, there's going to be mandatory social media check that occurs at the highest tier. It's just the right thing to do. You'll hear a lot of people reference, especially when you see a workplace violence or an active shooter situation, there's usually a lot of social media there. Wow, if we'd known this, that kind of thing. I don't expect that there's, obviously not that kind of social media out there on clearance holders, but I do believe there's some utility in gathering this. So at the highest, I talked about 3 new tiers, if you will. At the highest tier is going to be a mandatory social media check. Need to also mention, I know I'm over a minute here, Dave, or a couple minutes.
I'm not tracking it at all.
But what I need to also say about the use of, we and the government are very, very, we have some very hard lines in the sand from a privacy and civil liberties standpoint. Industry has much more flexibility on how they can utilize social media checks. But, for example, one hard line in the sand, and it was contained in our seed, was that this is public-facing social media, right? You cannot go in there and collect selectors from people. You can't get their passwords, that kind of thing. And I believe, and Ben can definitely correct me if I'm wrong here, but I see that as an extremely hard line, very line in the sand kind of thing.
You are in no way wrong. So that is certainly, so I think there's definitely a hard line there. And I will defer on the private sector. I'll say there are certainly legal hard lines with respect to the government on some of that collection. With respect to the Fourth Amendment, there are legal hard lines with respect to issues of viewpoint discrimination and associational freedom, all of which apply to the government. That, of course, does not mean that if I'm in the private sector, it is a great idea to engage in viewpoint discrimination. But we are, of course, affirmatively barred. So that is certainly one issue I would throw out there. I will add just quickly a second. Looking to the future, thinking carefully about other aspects of commercially available information. Gosh, there's a big spectrum there. We have some that we certainly use right now that are conglomerations of public records and do so appropriately. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, and I don't want to suggest that we are doing this, but if you just think about what that other end of the spectrum is, there are data aggregators that have location and purchase information about you that would make even the best intelligence officer blush. And so thinking about where on that spectrum we need to be in terms of what is needed from a security perspective and what is appropriate for the government to have and to utilize.
Fantastic, thank you. Good points. Sharon.
And I would say we do what we call open source checks as part of our pre-employment screening, but really that is a sophisticated Google type of check, so that we're not hiring somebody that, has just been in the news and that kind of thing. But we don't typically look into social media unless there's probable cause, or unless we have, a risk situation, because our models have indicated 15 indicators of a potential workplace violence.
Yep.
Where that's really important to understand what's going on, what that person's doing, blogging about, posting about. That would be the type of situation that we would use that. I would also say that the success of all of these programs is really hinges on our ability to share information, between to the people who need it and not overshare it. That's a very hard nut to crack, and I think we're all talking about that and working on that, and we want to keep that conversation going.
Yeah, especially, I'm sure industry doesn't want this to just be a one-way street, telling the government, here's what we know about, our cleared employee that's in your space. Well, what do you know about them, and should we keep in our employment? Thank you, Sharon. Tricia.
I'll just add that we don't pretend in executing this, Brian, and we're helping drive the policy, but we're really the executors, and we have a big lift, and we can't do it alone. So partnerships are everything. It's not lost on us that industry is a huge partner, and we've got to do a much better job of reaching out and making sure we understand your requirements and your unique nuances, and we're committed to doing that. And we're also not, it's not lost on us that anybody might think we are, looking at this through the lens of DOD. DOD is maybe 70% of the investigations, but we have 105 agencies to service, and that is first and foremost on our mind. Everybody's equal. We look forward to the partnerships. I think the messaging campaign that you guys have done in Booz Allen Hamilton is amazing. I think we could learn a lot from you, and we need to actually seek your advice on how we can do that at the federal enterprise, because we need that help. If I think we haven't done things quite as good as we could have, it would be messaging, it would be communications with our stakeholders, which is you, in things of this nature. And then two last things. I think we all need to be looking at this as how do we rehabilitate somebody who may be going astray because life happened. I really go back to the military, where I came from, and we put a lot of investments in our soldiers, a whole lot. In the first year, we put in an amazing investment. Why would we not want to protect that investment and help somebody who needs help? So that should be our motto, and we should never, ever not be looking at ourselves hard and continuing to improve. We should never be satisfied with our status quo.
Fantastic, Andy. Thank you very much. I want to just thank the audience and apologize to you. We probably had about 20 questions we didn't get to. I know they're sort of set an expectation and then poof, but I do appreciate your engagement. I want to ask you to say thank you to the panel. This is a very difficult, hard problem. It's never going to be perfect. We're always going to have fraudsters and spies and murderers in our midst. We're going to have traitors in our midst. We need a tighter program that does a much better job in helping make those trust and making and maintaining those trust determinations, and the folks up here are all working very diligently on that problem set. So please say thank you to them.